So I did read an interesting study lately which prompts the video, and it's surrounding the idea that the landscape of political differentiation of opinions differs wildly between the two schools of thought, or at least the sides of the spectrum, where you have lefties and you have righties, and how they believe in each other's doctrines or their own doctrines in certain ways informs what would be policy, social choices, as well as approbation, disapprobation, and conflict. The idea then that we have this divergence is not new, but I think the difference in the difference is quite interesting, because what you have with, and this is taking the picture from the recent analysis, is that on the left, and this is the top left graph, you have the blue, which is lefties, and then you have the red, which is righties, and that their differentiation on opinions is massive in terms of the, you call it standard deviation of the variance of the positions themselves, so the interpositions of belief. So you might align yourself with the right wing and then find yourself in a room full of right wing people and disagree tremendously with one another, to the degree that you're almost corresponding to a completely different school of thought. If you juxtapose, say, the most extreme northern and southern tips, the polarity there means that there exists a range of tenable positions. And this plurality is very interesting because it informs the dynamic principles around why lefties and righties are irreconcilable from themselves, but also why political forces differ in their efficacy. Because if we consider the fact that a neoliberal instrumental governance system purports to increase maximum well-being for the majority, we have this idea of egalitarianism that's at least downstream of what would be, you could say, the socialistic experiment of what if we uplifted everyone to a certain minimum level threshold? Is that something feasible and viable, and something that the common good ought to be structured upon? That leads us to what is leftism, modern leftism, because too far the other way is the untenable belief, basically, of communism, which we don't ascribe to and is very alien to the, you could say, the Western mind, the Occidental persona, where freedom just requires too much individuality and atomistic, say, thought process, ego differentiation. So when we understand that the Anglo-American mind will never comprehend collectivism in that way, then it's impossible as a position. Thus, we are resolved to at least instantiate a certain belief system on this collectivist idea at some minimum threshold, and that is, if we're in an egalitarian society, then I feel as if that's sufficient for my purpose. And that's how we get leftism, that's how you get liberalism. And it really is interesting that it was reduced to such a small agreement zone, that to be a liberal basically, or to be a leftist basically only provides a small window of belief system discrepancies. You must be part of the mainstream because there's not enough divergence to correspond to heterodox schools of thought or opinions. Now, we know from most interactions with liberals and leftists on almost all platforms, and you can see that here with Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and Reddit, that the left tends to, if not be equivalent in viewership or participation, then is the dominating force in some of these platforms. So like Reddit is mostly left, TikTok mostly leftist, Instagram mostly leftist, not by large percentages, but by some. So really it's down to Facebook and say Twitter to represent more balanced and or right-leaning views. Now, you consider the boomers on Facebook and they've got wild opinions on random crap you'll never even think about. But that does go into this rightism. It's like, do you have an opinion on aliens infecting your tap water with synthetic chemicals which can turn you into a homunculus? No, probably not. But a rightist in Florida may actually have that opinion. And that might start to differentiate him from a neocon, a conservative, who's much more considered around fiscal policy and has this really rhino or like small window aperture of belief systems which correspond to mainstream conservatism. And maybe that's the corresponding polarity point to liberal leftism. So he finds himself in the middle going, no, I'm a very reasonable conservative. even though conservatism is for retarded people. That's well the position he's going to take. So you can see that on those social media platforms represented quite distinctly, that the leftist positions tend toward a conformity, and in doing so, that's where you get this lack of diversity of thought. Once you are a leftist, you believe the same things as most other leftists. The collectivism as a self, as this identity, the identity is a performance for everyone else that you're in the tribe. This is how we all start to band together. And so disagreement is disapprobated. We don't like it if we're supposed to be all together as a friend and enemies. So you become a doctrinaire for this. It's a very simple pamphlet of 10 things you should believe. If it's something to do with trannies, if it's something to do with immigrants, if it's something to do with the environment, then you have to conform your belief system to whatever the purported mainstay of public opinion is. And this is how most mass media is able to control the narrative to that degree, is because you have to buy into liberal media because you're a liberal. There's no other way to do it. You have to conform to whatever Jon Stewart is telling you because Jon Stewart's the herald of reasonable rationalism. And that's where we are. If his opinion on abortion is X, then you also must hold that opinion because he's the guy who likes women. Or you see how I can reference that to some degree. Some reasonable point here is to say if he's reasonable ethically in that framework, then because I'm also a scrupulous person, then I tend towards that belief as well. Now, the problem is, you might call it that the right doesn't have that pillar. You could say the conservative movement in the West, up until about maybe 2005, Bushish era, Iraq, Afghanistan, did have a monolithic force behind it. There was the prevailing sentiment of conservatism, neoliberal conservatism, but very two sides of the same coin with the leftist neoliberalism. We're promoting the same ideology basically with a slight different tinge. And that's all. There was just a red tinge rather than a blue tinge, or whichever country's political system you were in at the time. If it's black, if it's CDU and CSU, or if it's the Tories or the Labour Party in the UK, these are all very similar parties promoting the same uniparty ideas. But with the advent and rise of a disenfranchised, but the anarchic principles of social media or spaces like forums, etc., you have the idea that, ideas can spread, and spread from not necessarily mouthpieces. It could be anonymous. You could have someone telling you something of their ideas and not actually have the prefabricated, bite-sized, piecemeal understanding of this is an acceptable opinion or not. It's promoting your own analytical skill, critical thinking. Do I actually think that this is true? Do I believe this? Is this something I should cherish as an idea? Which is much less prevalent on the left. They just don't have that need for that because social approval is already distinctly the essence of their political ideology. So with the right, though, there's interfighting, and there's this idea of purity spiraling, and even their own echo chambers are distorted to a large degree that doesn't represent the opposite side. It's this dissonance and the dissolution effect of that. And this is mostly familiar now on X, but I guess to some degree Facebook, as I said. The idea that you have political opinions which will vary within themselves is not new, but it's much more prevalent now and witnessable. Maybe that's the point you can make. It's that the right-wing parties of old tended to have fewer factions just through pragmatism and practicalities. It's hard to unite yourself without the centerpiece, without some centrifugal force. And so when you don't have that, then you have disparation. And when you don't bind, you just dissolve. Basically, there's no ability to provide the substrate or any mechanism by which you can bound a collectivist social group. And even if they disagree with each other in some fashion, say with a business, you can still bind people to the idea that you're coming to a job and a work for the single purpose, even if you don't agree with everyone at your workplace, at your office. So there is an ability to have an overarching principle which binds everyone into this ally, friend and enemy distinction. And this can come into certain, I want to say, problems when you start to over or underemphasize certain ideas in a macroscopic or a microscopic way. And what I mean by this is to say, I ask a leftist what they think of immigration, they might just say, it's good. And you don't necessarily need the nuance. You don't have to delve into what they think about that. It's just, is immigration from third world Fellahin society is good for us, yes or no? And if it's yes, what do you mean? Oh, well, there's nice foods and there's different colors of skin, which makes me feel something, I guess, whatever it is. But that's maybe the depth that you hit on most of those issues with most of these people. It's very rare on the right to have the same concurrence. You go in with the question of, do you like immigration? Typically, it's a right-wing answer to say no. But then following on from that, what type of immigration are we talking about? Because if it's in the Netherlands and I have German immigration, I'm probably actually fine with that, particularly juxtaposed with Moroccan immigration. If I was in America and I was in California as a right-winger, I would probably be against Mexican immigration, but maybe not Asian immigration. And so how you start to typify your answer diverges you out of the mainstream of conservatives in general. And historically, they were pro-immigration because they're retarded. But the modern rightists go, no, we don't like Mexicans, full stop, end of. But then some writers say, look, I actually don't like any immigrants at all, except X or except Y. And now this becomes such an irreconcilable point that you can't say to someone else in your group, in your right sphere, to say like, no, you actually have to, like, I am drawing the line here. This is an existential question for me of, I will fight to the death to make sure that my belief is superior to yours in that very definable difference. This is where you get that divergence, and there's the explosion of different embodiments of different superpositions or positions in general, which have, if the nexus is here, that all the vectors will be so spread out and the wide berth between, as I said before, the North and the South Pole here is almost a completely different ideology, even though on the spectrum it is at the right wing. So this is what you get when you have masculine urges, and particularly to combat. So how do you have factious internecine struggles? Well, it's because men like that, particularly masculinity promotes that, and this is actually what is the outcome for that. So once you start to pile on, and you can say compound these factors, these differentiated rubrics. So it's not just immigration, it's maybe also healthcare, it's maybe also all social policies, basically, economic policies, anything you can think of, including war, defense spending, anything like this becomes an issue that doesn't have a mainstream talking point from the right wing. They'll go, no, I actually want 90% of my GDP to be spent on military, and I won't budge on that. I want there to be the reincarnation of Mussolini, and I won't budge on that. And then every opinion in between is now a reflective position. The left don't do this. They go, no, Bernie Sanders, he's the guy. Who cares what his other policies are? Who cares what his interests are? I just think Bernie Sanders, he's the one for me. I don't have to think. I'm in the right. I'm on the right side of history. I have the moral position. And so any other differentiation here is something that's an uncomfortable, queasy qualm for me. So with that, then I say, look, I'm able to just correspond all my values and opinions to whatever Bernie says is right. And there you are. It's a very simplistic way, and for, I guess, pragmatic reasons, is quite a good position, because it makes it very simple, and you can offshore, outsource all your critical thinking and thoughts and all of this stuff. So you can admire it from that degree. So less critical thinking is actually mentally less taxing and neurologically more pleasing, perhaps, even if the outcomes are not actually in the interests you purported to have, which don't obviously correspond to social policies or political policies. Now, I think maybe that speaks more into also the lack of nuance and having this subset of ideas. So you can bring it from the ideology down to the doctrinal component or relational component. So there's just a school of psychological thought on this decision making. There's not much value in psychology as a school. It's fairly weak. There's a lot of noise. But there are some structures which hold true enough, general-ish principles, which you can abide by. These particularly go into decision-making. How we can start to identify is also important. So decision-making from an identification. And you can see here that so this graph in the middle down the bottom tells us about the conservative, or whatever moniker you have if you think you're a conservative or a liberal, in the university faculty space. And so you can see here, obviously, completely bias and strong linear increase of socially liberal and moderates staff members of faculty, because the university stopped being about, say, free thinking or critical thinking, or a place to promote certain say classical ideas of education, and much more around a job factory, one, or B, an indoctrination of something. There's one way to think about these things, here it is, and now you have to believe those things. So this becomes a massive issue, obviously, and this goes into that doctrinal component, because you're teaching everyone a certain strain of thought that's told to be the default truth. It's de facto true because we're telling you it is. And in doing this, you do give rise to both an unthinking zombification class. So everyone goes in with the same beliefs and they go, this has to be true because I've indoctrinated into them being true. The demagogues have spouted off these truths to me that my whole life, and so therefore ipso facto I have to believe them, versus, hey, actually, if I don't believe this one eidolon, this spook that I've been told, maybe all of them are false, and then you have the cascade effect of your entire belief system being demolished, which does lead to, once again, more nuance being available to you in thought. Now I take a position on everything that I've ever been told. It's not enough that history was told to me in a way. It's actually, I question the mouthpieces of history, and what I've been told about history may actually be a lie in many ways, because the opinions of historians or the communicators of history can influence what they're telling you, and obviously they do. This was Spengler's concern with historians, is that they're much more confused than they are, I'd say, truth tellers or fact relayers, and much more concerned about methodologies and accounting of history, and then their own moral projections on certain things. The idea that war is bad is because people are implementing, or they're imputing their own ethical standards onto an event, onto an action that doesn't necessarily have to be true. And war is not bad. Some wars can be bad, but that's not the same thing. So that's how we start to understand this subset. We're magnifying these disagreement potentials, basically, which can go into game theory. You can understand how you have concurrence in a game situation where there's a matrix of certain outcomes or agreed upon stances, but they can differ, and we would only agree if there's a, say, possible outcome that's correspondent to us agreeing on it. As I said before, the masculine urge to combat is almost higher than cooperate. And so we do get this unfortunate result here, that you have the multi-step requirements of a debate or a concern or an agreement than you do on the left, which is just the passive concurrence. I think then to have the denouement here, or the peroration, it's to say that we like the idea that we have a tribe and a social group, and it's important for us to understand that politically it's a necessity for us to agree on a overarching social policy. If it's an economic interest, if it's a political, explicitly political, if it's a religious interest, if it's a, you want to go sociological interest, that is how we define political concept, or the political bodies. We back an interest like this, and they can transform over time. We could say there's a merchant class which forms a nation state, and then every decision made in extremis is the sovereign decision made by that merchant class's idea of a state. But when that transforms and stops being the merchant class decision making, and maybe transforms into a religious sect or the peasant class, you can see how the state continuation is actually a precedent rather than an antecedent. It's the continuation almost of this idea. So going forward, if you want to understand why there's such disparity between beliefs on this side, and the purity cycles exist, and you have what is the Mexican Nick Fuentes versus the traditional American patriot J.D. Vance, I don't know, whoever you would consider the polar opposite, inside the same sphere, there exists this inability to concur with each other, and that just comes down to A, masculine identity around conflict and combat, but then B, the importance of nuance as a enemy and friend distinction.